Redux, as you might have noticed, implementing and maintaining state in a React application can be somewhat challenging, especially when you have multiple layers of components that contain other components that are nested inside of each other. You have to, at some point, you have to maintain state and then notify of these state changes down to the components that are nested inside of parent components, and you have to link them together using attributes all the way down, and any notifications of events that might happen at the low level components, child components would need to notify it somehow up the chain of command of whoever is maintaining the state to update that state, right? And this state goes up and down this hierarchy of nested components, and it's oftentimes very awkward to have this communication going down, up and down this chain. So Redux looks at a different way of maintaining state. What it does is that it rips out the entire management of state outside of the component and creates kind of like a global variable almost, right? It'll have the convenience of a global variable, but without the bad things that go with maintaining something that's global, right? There'll still be some good API. It'll be more like a singleton, right? That is responsible for maintaining this one single source of truth, right? Of what is the current state of the application, right? And we'll be able to query it anywhere inside of any component. They can ask me, hey, what's my state, right? What we'll be able to do is have every component be a stateless component, right? So that no component will ever be responsible for maintaining the state ever again, right? There'll be dumb components. They'll be responsible for notifying somebody that says, hey, somebody clicked on this. What should happen, right? But this is not their responsibility anymore, right? Instead, we're going to centralize all that knowledge in one single place, right? That will control that. And will generate what the next state should be, right? And then this state can then be piped into the component, and the component can then just render, right? So we'll reduce the responsibility of components to just rendering whatever data we give it, and then notifying any events that might occur, right? But it itself will not be responsible for maintaining any state. We could have some state, perhaps. If the state belongs and it's self-contained only to that one component, sure, you could have a minimal state inside of that one component. But if that state needs to travel out and go, travel between components, we're not going to use the regular mechanism of attributes and things like that, right? It will always be through the Redux state management. Okay, so let's take a look at what's about Redux. Everything I said. This is going to decouple, right, the responsibilities of rendering, right, event handling, and maintaining state. Right now, they're all together. Right? Everything is the responsibility of the component. Right? We're going to rip out the responsibility of maintaining state out of the component and have it as a separate thing. Right? This is also going to allow us to have, as I mentioned earlier, stateless components. And stateless components are much easier to test, right? That's why it's become so popular in the React audience, right? That it's very easy to test a component that has no state. You can just pass it an object. It renders what it's supposed to do, and then you can compare and say, okay, is it rendering what I was expecting, right? And then you can compare against the DOM that you were expecting. That's much easier than to test something that changes over time, right? That if I, like an account, right? If I deposit and then I withdraw, then I transfer, it changes state over time. It's very hard to test something that has to have an initial state, right? That evolves over time. Yes, that's much harder to test as opposed to testing a function that you say, well, is 2 plus 3, is that equal to 5? Yeah, it will always be equal to 5, right? It doesn't change over time, right? It's much trivial to test something that is functional than to test something that has state. Make sense? Right? Redux allows us to build components that are stateless, so we can test these things separately. Here's a map of what what the different jargon, what the different things that we're going to be looking at. Most of what we've seen so far is just the component all by itself, who has receives events from the user. It notifies and handles perhaps writes here inside of the component and changes its own state. We're going to change that a little bit instead. We're going to introduce the notion of a reducer. Right, the reducer is going to be the container or the parent, the owner of the state. Right, it is going to be the sole responsibility of knowing what the current state should be. Right, it's kind of going to play a little bit the role of a controller in a model view controller. Right, it's going to receive certain events. Right, that hey, I need to add a new course, I need to remove a course, I need to rename a course. All these events are going to be flooding into, all these actions, right? They're going to be flooding into the reducer, and the reducer says, oh, okay. Internally, it will implement something that looks very much like a state machine, like a finite state machine where you have all bunch of states, yes, and the different events allow you to transition from one state to another state, yes. And all the possible state are represented in the reducer. Right? And the reducer says, okay, what's my current state? What's the event? And then it calculates or decides what the next event should be. Right? So if I'm in this event and that event occur, I'm going to transition to this new event. If it was at this state, it was some other event, I'll transition to another event, to another state. Yes? Right. So its responsibility is to generate a stream of states. Yes? So this state is going to travel its way back into the component, right? Back into the component, and the component will take this state as a plain old JSON object, right? And it'll render, and as it renders, it's ready to receive more events as the user interacts, and then the whole thing starts all over again, right? Everything else, right, like the provider, the dispatcher, things like that, and the container, these are glue. Right? These are glue technologies that allow us to connect, right, this state management mechanism with our component rendering mechanism. Right? What happens is that Redux is not React specific. Right? Redux is a technology that can be used, with many other rendering engines, right? It could be used with Angular, right? It could be used with Ember. It can be with a whole bunch of other competing mechanisms. With a Vue, it can be used with anything. Yes, it's just a mechanism that can maintain state, right? So we need to glue it to our world, the React world, okay? And that glue is this provider, these containers, this dispatcher, right? This is what glues together the React world with the Redux world. Make sense? Right. Also, the Redux introduces the notion of a store. Right. The store is like what it suggests. It's where the state lives. Right. The reducer is responsible for generating a stream of states, right, that are stored in the store. Right. And it never. The state is never mutated, right? It's not like I have a state and then I go into that state and I tweak a couple of things like we've been doing, right? The way we've been working is a component maintains a state, yes? And depending on the events, it goes back into a state and says, this dot set state, and it manipulates a subset of that state, yes? Right? And the state changes. Not here. Right, what Redux does is that it doesn't throw away the old state. Right, it just generates a brand new state. It always generates the next state. Right, it's not a modification of the previous state. I'm just telling you what the next state is. All right. So the store, for instance, one of the things that it could do is to keep track of a list of all the states of which the application has traversed through time. Okay. And you could perhaps implement mechanisms that you can travel back in time, right, and have the application go and jump between all these states, right? As the states are generated as a stream of states, right, the application moves forward. But you could very easily just do a playback, right, and do a reverse. It says, well, let me jump into different states, right, and put the application at a particular state. Yes?
Does the store have a limit of how much you can like store, or is that like?
Yeah, no, it's whatever the memory of the browser will give you. Okay. Yeah, yeah. And you can fast forward and reverse and do things like undo. Undo now becomes trivial, right? Undo is just just walking this tree, this diagram of states backwards, right, into a previous state of the application, and the rendering just represents that state that the application is in. Make sense? Right? Okay. The concept is very easy, right? What the really hard part of understanding Redux is the plumbing, right? How to plumb these two different worlds. How to plumb the React world, which is fairly simple that we understood, and this new idea of the Redux is also fairly simple. But the plumbing and the connection is very syntax intensive. All right? So please bear with me. We're going to plumb it several times, right? At some point, hope that you find what the pattern is. It says, I see, right? I connect this to this, I connect that to that, right? And then I plumb it. The plumbing is the really hard part, right? But the concept is trivial, right? So don't get lost in the plumbing. Once you set up the plumbing, then there's you usually don't have to set it up ever again, right? Oftentimes you come into a Redux project and somebody has already set up the plumbing, right? So you don't have to deal with any of that, right? That's the hard part. But because we're learning this from scratch, yes, we will have to drudge through this painful part, right, of setting up the plumbing. Pretty good? All right. So let's look at let's first install it and start working with Redux.